NATO peacekeepers in Kosovo, including British troops, say they've detained over 40 people following yesterday's violence, which left 2 people dead and many others injured. Albanians in the town of Mitrovica attacked soldiers after protests that they hadn't done enough to protect them from local Serbs. From the town, our chief news correspondent, Kate Adey, sent us this report.
There's peace in Kosovo, but there's violence and misery as well. Yet more families leaving their homes today. Albanians forced out by the French soldiers of KFOR, this woman claimed. No, they were intimidated by the Serbs, say the French. Mitrovica is a tough mining town where tolerance is unknown. South of the river is exclusively Albanian. To the north are 10,000 Serbs, with about 1,000 Albanians as well. And there's been trouble in the north ever since the NATO-led KFOR troops arrived last year. Yesterday, it got out of hand with hours of shooting.
A lot of people observing us, binoculars, so on, often carrying weapons. And clearly they also had mobile phones and were communicating. The impression we got was that it was a crowd that was organised.
Organised, but everyone disputes what happened. 1 Albanian died, 2 French soldiers were wounded, and a dozen civilians were injured. The French blame both sides, but have arrested 45 Albanians and 1 Serb. KFOR were under attack all day, and Albanian snipers were identified. The Albanians blame the French, saying they don't give them enough protection. The Serbs are hostile to all of KFOR and the Albanians. In the middle, literally, are the British, providing muscle on the bridge. They patrol the riverbank, on the lookout for snipers, and stopping young men trying to reinforce both factions. While the French general in charge tried to appear even-handed, and his men are toughening their response on the ground, his nasty local difficulty is being watched apprehensively by the UN and NATO in the rest of Kosovo. Both Serbs and Albanians are making it nearly impossible that they live next to one another. There's fear and violence on both sides. All the efforts of the international community are meant to ensure peaceful coexistence. At the moment, this town will have none of that. Kate Adey, BBC News, Mitrovica.
A NATO-led peacekeeping force in Kosovo has come under attack from Serbs throwing stones and bottles. The KFOR soldiers were searching for weapons in the divided city of Mitrovica, where, as Kate Adey reports, violence has already left 9 people dead.
The town of Mitrovica is an embarrassment to the NATO-led force in Kosovo. Trying to pacify it and find a solution which will placate both Albanians and Serbs has so far proved difficult. Today's operation was meant to clear out weapons and fighters. With all roads sealed, British troops stopped and searched every vehicle and individual in their sector. It's a painstaking business, with derelict buildings easily concealing guns and ammunition, and with the weighty help of the Canadian pioneers to get into suspect hiding places. However, these searches yielded nothing. Across the river, things were running into trouble. 350 Americans had arrived to search the Serbian district. They sealed off the university area and before long were accused of heavy-handed tactics. A US soldier used a pepper spray on a Serb, provoking violence and confusion. The French, who are officially in charge of this area, yet again failed to take charge of the situation, a criticism that has been leveled at them for months. The Americans, with 2 soldiers injured, had by then been ordered to leave and were pelted in their retreat. Only a handful of weapons had been found. The Italian Carabinieri, as unclear as anyone in their role, took a casualty. The Germans arrived, to jeers and missiles. All in all, a crowd armed with bottles, stones and snowballs managed to prostrate a fighting force which has 2,500 troops in the town. It's all down to policy, with not a little infighting among NATO forces. The French have their own way of doing things and they're in charge here. But the atmosphere in this volatile town is affecting the whole of Kosovo, and both sides have threatened violence if a solution isn't found. Kate Adey, BBC News, Mitrovica.
Tear gas has been fired at thousands of ethnic Albanians who are trying to break through a cordon of UN peacekeepers, separating them from Serbs in the town of Mitrovica in Kosovo. The trouble started when at least 10,000 Albanians who'd marched the 25 miles from the capital Pristina reached the main bridge in the centre of Mitrovica.
The column of marchers left Kosovo's capital Pristina early this morning. From the start, the organisers admitted they had little hope of controlling the tens of thousands who took to the road. They were mostly men, determined to ally themselves with the Albanians of Mitrovica in their confrontation with the Serbs living in the north of the town. One organiser said they would need NATO's help to stop the marchers pressing on into the Serb areas. They were supposed to stop some distance from Mitrovica and send a token delegation to the centre. But with columns advancing from several different directions, they simply press past NATO's roadblocks. In the centre of Mitrovica, there's been a standoff for most of the day, with local Albanians facing NATO troops blocking the bridge which divides the town. Several hundred Serbs gathered on the opposite side, while NATO riflemen took station on rooftops to watch for snipers. NATO troops were prepared for trouble, but had to struggle to keep control once the extra Albanians arrived.
It's touch and go, it really is. I mean, there have been repeated attempts by the crowd to surge forward. There are repeated pushes forward through to the British lines, and the Danish troops, when they see that behind them, they just fire the tear gas into the air.
NATO have brought reinforcements into the town to keep order, with British troops in the front line of the disturbances. Brian Hanrahan, BBC News.
Our correspondent Kate Adey joins us now from Mitrovica. Kate, I know that you too witnessed this confrontation on the bridge. What did you see?
We had about 200 men of the Royal Green Jackets facing what is an estimated 40 to 50,000 demonstrators who funneled down towards the bridge. And it was an afternoon, 5 hours of heaving and shoving and shunting and yelling and a lot of noise, but there was no actual violence. It got pretty tough and rough at times, but the soldiers had been ordered not to use violence. They didn't even have their batons out. They linked arms and they pushed and they shoved, and it was extremely rough. But when it got to a point where the demonstrators might have broken through, the French fired repeated numbers of tear gas rounds, choking and gasping. Both the soldiers, who had to get their respirators out while they were pushing and shoving, got a bit of time and then managed to keep them back. All of this time, there were repeated calls by the colonel of the Green Jackets, Colonel Carter, to calm down, to stay calm, that the British were in sympathy with what they were demonstrating about. They recognized it as a lawful demonstration. But it was a very rough 5 hours.
Kate, thank you.
Good evening. NATO insisted today that the situation in Kosovo was under control, despite the eruption of all the old hatreds in the divided town of Mitrovica. The decision to send no more troops for the time being was taken after apparently conflicting advice from the military commanders and another plea from the civilian UN mission for 2,500 extra police. But NATO's dilemma was eased when troops today contained and cut off a big Serb rally in Mitrovica, the flashpoint northern town. From there, Jeremy Bowen reports.
In the biggest security operation so far in Mitrovica, KFOR troops packed the bridge that separates the Serb and the Albanian sides of the town. On the Serb bank of the river, they sealed off all the roads that lead to the bridge. Hundreds of soldiers and dozens of armoured vehicles were deployed. French troops searched every car entering the area from outlying Serbian villages. It was all to deter any trouble at this mass rally of Mitrovica's Serbs, and there wasn't any. Instead, the local Serb leader told them that if KFOR couldn't protect them from the Albanians, then Serbs would protect themselves. They deny they take orders from Belgrade and mock anybody who says that Serbian paramilitaries have returned to Mitrovica.
Look at these people, 16 years, 17 years old, or kids. Of course, they are not paramilitary. They are just worried for his destiny, nothing more.
But what nobody here denies is that Mitrovica's Serbs and Albanians hate and suspect each other. Mitrovica is the big test for the foreign powers who intervened in Kosovo. If they can rebuild a multi-ethnic society here, it's going to be much easier elsewhere. But after 9 months, the main strategy is still to bring in more troops to deepen the separation between the two halves of this city. On the Albanian side, French troops protect the last Serb community, a priest, his family, and an empty church. On the Serb side, they're guarding the last small Albanian enclave. A handful of families are left, among them the Azemis. Their daughter, Kimete, gets a hard time from the local Serb men.
Say, hey, you bitch, where are you going? It's not possible to go on this street because you are Albanian. You are a good girl for me.
Her brother, Minir, faced more than words. They think he was killed by Serb paramilitaries in the house across the road during the NATO bombing. Kimete's father showed the bullet holes and some bones. Perhaps Kosovo's Serbs and Albanians are better apart, but bringing them together is still Western policy. And until the hate goes, the barbed wire is going to have to stay. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Mitrovica.
So what are the pressures now building up on the Kosovo peacekeepers? NATO's Supreme Commander, General Wesley Clark, wants more troops. The alliance insists those already there are sufficient for the time being. Much hinges on how NATO expects the situation to develop, as our correspondent Brian Hanrahan reports.
NATO's response masks confusion about who to blame for the disturbances in Mitrovica. On the face of it, the Albanians caused this week's troubles. They sniped at NATO. They called the demonstration which nearly overwhelmed NATO lines. But US officials believe that the Albanian population are being deliberately provoked by Serbs trying to undermine NATO's position in Kosovo.
The Serb leadership in Belgrade is trying to partition Kosovo at the Mitrovica Bridge. This is a campaign being directed by Belgrade, directed by President Milosevic and his senior colleagues. They are infiltrating people.
Mitrovica is the only Serb area in Kosovo which borders directly on Serbia and would be an ideal base for Serb attempts to destabilize the region. But NATO commanders also fear a renewed Serb campaign in the Presevo Valley, just inside Serbia, which would force out 100,000 Albanians living there. Or military action against Montenegro, where the local government is resisting Belgrade's control. To guard against these dangers, NATO wants men. But since the first entry into Kosovo, many countries have run down their contribution, and many contingents are well below their proper strength. NATO wants them to live up to their promises for what may be a long haul.
Today's meeting reflected the common determination of all of the allies to stay the course in Kosovo, to see the job through, to devote whatever resources are necessary to getting that job done, and to making sure that we do not leave before we have achieved a secure, democratic and multi-ethnic Kosovo.
In Belgrade, President Milosevic has survived the winter and has now started to rebuild his political base. By attacking NATO's presence in Kosovo as shameful, he appeals to Serb patriotism, and he suggests that Serb forces will return in June when the UN mandate expires. Serbia remains unstable and explosive. The funeral of Arkan, the former warlord gunned down outside Belgrade's best hotel, is a vivid reminder that Serbia's politics are lawless. And NATO believes that President Milosevic creates turbulence to maintain his power. Brian Hanrahan, BBC News.
Kent County Council is